Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that before this weekend ends, something in your life is supposed to shift and heaven is waiting on you to move? Not tomorrow, not when you feel more ready, but now, because what God said to you wasn't a suggestion, it was a summons. And the longer you wait, the more you risk missing the moment that was made for your obedience. You didn't stumble into this message. You were meant to hear this. The urgency of obedience is not merely a moral ideal, it is a spiritual reality. When God speaks, his words are not empty suggestions floated into the ether for us to consider at our leisure. They are timely, living, and precise. There is always purpose in the moment of instruction. When God tells you to do something, it is not just about the what, it is about the when. The call to act carries an invisible clock with it. The moment is not random. It is wrapped in divine coordination, intended to fit within a sequence you may not see but that heaven has already designed. This is why delayed obedience is not just a lesser version of faith, it is disobedience in disguise. We often think that, as long as we intend to obey, we are in the clear. That, as long as our heart agrees with God's instruction, we are faithful. But this is the subtle trap. Obedience that is postponed is not obedience at all, it is rebellion dressed in polite procrastination. You can nod your head at a command and still walk in the opposite direction. In heaven's court, the timing is as crucial as the act itself. Consider a soldier in battle. If his commanding officer says now and he replies later, the entire mission could collapse. Timing in obedience is not about convenience, it is about coordination. When God says move, he has also arranged people, circumstances, and spiritual realities to intersect at the moment of your action. You are not obeying in a vacuum. Your obedience sets off a chain reaction, and when you hesitate, the chain breaks. This urgency is often muffled by our culture's obsession with control. We want to understand the full picture before we act. We want to calculate risks, ask questions, run simulations in our minds. We say, I'm just waiting on confirmation, when in truth, we already have it, we're just afraid of what it might cost. What we call caution, heaven might call cowardice. We like to delay so we can disguise our fear as wisdom. But God never asked us to be certain, he asked us to be faithful. And faith, by its very nature, demands swiftness. The window of obedience is not always open. God's command comes with a built-in expiration. Not because his love fades, but because his purposes march forward. To hesitate is to miss your place in the procession. To pause too long is to fall out of step with what is unfolding. We think the stakes are low because we do not always see the fruit of what could have happened if we had obeyed immediately. But this is precisely the enemy's strategy. He doesn't always tempt us to do evil, he tempts us to wait. He whispers, you can still do it tomorrow, knowing that tomorrow rarely comes. He does not need you to say no to God. He only needs you to say, not yet. That's all it takes to derail a destiny. When God speaks, we are being invited into something greater than ourselves, and that invitation is not open-ended. Think of how many blessings are not missing, they're just mistimed. They didn't die because we didn't believe, they evaporated because we didn't act. You can believe a plane is good and still miss it if you show up at the airport too late. Obedience has a boarding time. And there is also a deep, sobering truth behind the urgency of obedience. When we delay, our heart begins to shift. The longer you ignore the call, the quieter it sounds. Not because God is silent, but because your spirit becomes desensitized. Conviction doesn't vanish in an instant. It fades. The flame doesn't go out with a gust, it dies with neglect. This is why the first nudge matters. That first whisper is often the purest moment of clarity. The longer you sit with it without acting, the more your mind intervenes to argue against your spirit. Obedience delayed opens the door to confusion, and confusion gives birth to doubt. Not because God changed his mind, but because we entertained too many other voices. To obey God when he speaks is to honor his wisdom in choosing that moment. It is to say, you know better than I do, not just what I should do, but when. And that acknowledgement, expressed in immediate action, is one of the highest forms of worship. It is trust in motion. It is reverence lived out. And the moment for it is now. Spiritual procrastination is not always loud or obvious. It doesn't show up as defiance, nor does it wear the face of rebellion. It is subtle, dignified, and often dressed in good intentions. It looks like saying, I'll pray about it, when you already know the answer. It sounds like I'm just waiting for the right time when God has already said the time is now. It hides in to-do lists in productivity apps, in a sense of being too busy. But beneath the surface, it is a deeply dangerous condition of the soul, the quiet postponement of what God has clearly called you to do. This kind of procrastination is one of the enemy's most effective tools. He rarely begins by telling us to reject God outright. That approach would awaken our defenses. Instead, he lulls us into delay. If he can't make you disobey directly, he'll simply convince you that obedience can wait. He'll distract you with noble tasks. He'll make you feel guilty for not doing everything, so you do nothing. He'll whisper that obedience needs to be perfect or it isn't worth starting. He knows you won't betray God with a sword, but you might with a snooze button. At the heart of spiritual procrastination is the illusion of tomorrow. We convince ourselves that more time will bring more clarity, that later will be easier, that conditions will eventually become ideal. But that tomorrow never arrives. It always promises and never delivers. The myth of a better time is the very thing that steals the only time we're guaranteed, now. The enemy feeds you the hope of future obedience just long enough for the present to expire. There is a great danger in assuming that God's instructions come without time limits. We treat his voice as if it's an open invitation, as if we can RSVP whenever we like. But when God speaks, it is because something has aligned, something we cannot see, but something that matters. There are people being prepared, doors creaking open, hearts softening, and conditions forming. His call doesn't come in a vacuum. It comes within the divine orchestration of moments, people, and movements. When we delay, we step outside of that alignment. The opportunity doesn't always wait for us. Some windows are not repeated. Some hearts do not stay open. Some moments, if missed, are missed forever. And yet we tell ourselves God is patient, as if his patience is permission for procrastination. We confuse his mercy with his approval. Yes, God is slow to anger, but that does not mean he is slow to act. His grace is not a license to delay. It is a gift meant to lead us to obedience. The longer we delay, the more we expose our hearts to the slow decay of resistance. Every act of hesitation, no matter how small, adds another brick to the wall between us and God's will. Eventually we look up and can no longer hear his voice, not because he stopped speaking, but because we've drowned him out with our own delays. The most tragic part of spiritual procrastination is that it often happens in the name of good things. We say, "I'm just waiting for peace," when we are actually avoiding discomfort. We say, "I need confirmation," when we've already received it 10 times. We pray for a sign, ignoring the fact that the very burden on our hearts is the sign. We over-spiritualize our indecision, hoping to cover our fear with the language of faith. But faith that doesn't move is no faith at all. Faith requires risk, and procrastination is often a disguise for self-preservation. We delay because we don't want to fail, don't want to be misunderstood, don't want to feel foolish. But in trying to avoid one kind of pain, we walk right into a deeper one, the slow grief of unfulfilled purpose. And still, spiritual procrastination feels safe. It feels moral. It feels responsible. That's what makes it so dangerous. We rarely confess it as sin because it doesn't look like rebellion. But it is. It is the quiet rejection of God's timing. It is the soft no wrapped in a maybe. It is the refusal to trust that when God speaks, he means now, not when we feel ready, not when life feels easier, but now. And when we postpone obedience, we are not simply delaying a task, we are delaying intimacy, growth, transformation, and the joy of partnering with God in real time. The cost of delay is almost always invisible at first. It hides itself in the margins of our lives, in the empty spaces between good intentions and real obedience. When God speaks and we hesitate, nothing dramatic usually happens right away. The sky does not darken. No thunder strikes. Life carries on, and this is what makes delay so deceptively comfortable. It feels like nothing has changed. But the shift begins quietly, underneath the surface, where spiritual momentum and divine timing once waited. What we don't see is the slow erosion of opportunity, the quiet closing of doors, and the misalignment that grows between our lives and God's purpose. God's instructions are not simply commands, they are appointments. They carry with them timing that is often unseen. When we are told to act, to move, to speak, or to let go, it's not just about us. It's about a bigger picture God is arranging. We are part of a divine sequence. When we delay, we step out of rhythm. It's like showing up late to a symphony. Your part may still be played, but not in harmony with the rest. And that misalignment creates ripple effects we can't always trace, but they're real nonetheless. One of the most subtle and costly results of delay is the missed encounter. There are moments when someone's heart is soft, when they're open to a word, a gesture, a prayer just for a short time. If you're nudged to reach out and you wait, that window may close, not out of cruelty but because people change, hearts harden, circumstances shift. Delay can cause you to miss the very assignment God gave you because He knew the timing mattered as much as the action. You don't always get to see the consequence, but that doesn't make it any less tragic. Another hidden cost is the weight of compounded obedience. When we delay once, we rarely delay only once. Procrastination tends to multiply. The longer you postpone a step of faith, the heavier it becomes. What was once a simple yes now feels like an impossible burden. The action itself hasn't changed, but you have. Fear has grown. Doubt has had time to build its case. The heart has begun to rationalize, to forget the clarity of that first moment when the instruction came. And what could have been a quick, clean act of obedience now feels tangled and overwhelming. There is also the slow decay of conviction. When you ignore the nudge of God's voice long enough, it begins to fade. Not because God gives up on you, but because you have trained your heart to be unresponsive. What once stirred you deeply now barely registers. What once felt urgent now seems optional. This is perhaps one of the most frightening results of delay, not just that we miss an opportunity, but that we become people who no longer feel the weight of missed opportunities. Our hearts become dull, not all at once, but degree by degree, until one day silence feels normal. We should not mistake delay for neutrality. To delay is to decide, even if we tell ourselves otherwise. It is to say no to God's timing, even if we claim to say yes to His will. And this refusal, cloaked as indecision, can redirect the course of our lives. Sometimes we do not recognize how significant a moment of obedience is until years later, when we're left wondering how our lives took the shape they did. We trace it back not to an outright rebellion, but to a hesitation, a moment of waiting when we should have moved. In some cases, delay costs us deeply personal things. Relationships that could have healed, dreams that could have started, callings that could have flourished. God is merciful, and He redeems. But even mercy does not erase consequence. The cost of delay is often not punishment, it is simply what happens when we step out of sync with the plan He crafted in love and wisdom. There is no cruelty in it, just the cold laws of spiritual momentum. When you don't plant in spring, you cannot harvest in autumn. When you don't speak when the door is open, you may not be allowed back in the room. The pain of these delays is often not immediate, and that is why they are so dangerous. We feel no sting today, so we assume the delay is harmless. But what we delay today becomes the regret of tomorrow. What we ignore now may echo for years in the chambers of what might have been. And we carry those echoes not because God is cruel, but because He spoke and we waited. Clarity comes in motion. This is one of the paradoxes of the spiritual life, and yet it is one of its most consistent truths. We often wait for full understanding before we move, thinking that God will first unfold the entire path so we can walk it with confidence. We expect that if something is truly from God, then it will come with certainty, clear instructions, and guaranteed outcomes. But the life of faith doesn't work like that. It never has. God rarely gives blueprints. He gives steps, and He reveals the next one not while you stand still in hesitation, but as you move in obedience. This truth frustrates the modern mind. We are conditioned to believe that planning is wisdom and caution is maturity. We love guarantees. We want to weigh risks, calculate rewards, and make decisions based on full knowledge. But God deals in trust, not control. He is not interested in giving us full understanding before we act. He is interested in seeing if we will act based on who He is, not on what we can predict. And so, He calls us to move when things are still unclear, when the road ahead looks foggy, and when the outcome is unknown, because it is in the movement itself that the clarity begins to form. This principle is woven all throughout Scripture. Abraham left his homeland not knowing where he was going, only that God had told him to go. The Israelites stepped into the Jordan River while the water was still flowing. It only parted after their feet touched it. Peter got out of the boat before he was sure he could walk. Faith always precedes the miracle. Obedience always precedes the explanation. God could explain everything in advance, but he often chooses not to, because if we saw the entire journey, we might shrink back. He gives us just enough light for the next step, and we discover more as we walk forward. This walking forward without full clarity is not foolishness, it is maturity. It is the recognition that understanding is not a prerequisite for obedience. It's a result of it. We often say we are waiting for confirmation, when in reality, confirmation often comes in the doing. It's not that God hasn't spoken clearly. It's that we haven't started walking yet. When you finally act on what you know he said, things begin to make sense. Doors open. People appear. Provision arrives. But none of that happens until movement begins. There's a deep irony here. The thing you want clarity is being withheld until you move. And the reason is simple. If you had all the clarity you wanted, you wouldn't need faith. You'd be operating in knowledge, not trust. And trust is the currency of relationship with God. He's not trying to test you just for the sake of testing. He's inviting you into a relationship where trust matters more than comfort, and where obedience is rooted not in sight but in love. This is what makes spiritual inertia so dangerous. We believe that staying still keeps us safe, but in the spiritual life, stagnation leads to confusion. The longer you wait for clarity before you move, the cloudier everything becomes. Your sense of calling fades, the urgency dulls, doubt creeps in, you begin to wonder if you ever really heard God at all. But the issue isn't that you heard wrong. The issue is that you stayed still when you should have stepped forward. Clarity was waiting for you on the other side of action. But you never got there. Some people spend years circling the same questions, not because the answers aren't available, but because they refuse to move. They are paralyzed by the need to be certain. But faith is not certainty. It is the willingness to walk forward in the fog, trusting that God sees what you don't. It's the courage to act on the little you do know, rather than waiting for perfect information that will never come. God never promised us perfect clarity before we obey, but he has promised to walk with us when we do. And that is enough. It must be enough. Because when you begin to move, when you take even a small step in the direction you believe he is calling, something happens. The fog doesn't lift all at once, but a path begins to form beneath your feet. And step by step, with each act of obedience, things that once seemed hidden begin to make sense. The weight of responsibility in our obedience is far greater than we often admit. We live in a world where personal decisions are treated as private matters, isolated from the broader tapestry of other lives. But this is not how the spiritual life works. In the kingdom of God, obedience is rarely only about the person obeying. It is often the key that unlocks something in someone else's life. Our choices, especially those prompted by divine instruction, are like stones thrown into a pond. The ripples reach far beyond where we drop them. When God tells you to move, to speak, to act, he is not just shaping your path. He is orchestrating outcomes for others as well. Your obedience is often an answer to someone else's prayer. You may be the person sent to encourage, to warn, to provide, to release, or to speak life into a heart hanging on by a thread. And when you delay or refuse, they are left waiting, not because God cannot work around you, but because he chose to work through you. There is a weight to that calling, not in a burdensome sense, but in a holy, sobering one. We often think of our obedience as a transaction between us and God. He commands, we respond, and the result is our growth, our blessing, or our refinement. But this is only half the story. Our obedience is often an intersection point, the place where someone else's need meets God's provision. That provision is delivered through us, through the words we speak, the risks we take, and the courage we summon. Heaven's answers often arrive in human hands. When we delay, we become the bottleneck. Someone's breakthrough is stalled not because God is absent, but because his chosen vessel hesitated. This is one of the sobering truths of the spiritual journey. We are not the center of the story. We are characters in a vast, living narrative crafted by a God who connects lives in ways we cannot fathom. What you say yes to today may rescue someone you've never met. A conversation you feel nudged to start may be the turning point in someone else's life. A gift you are prompted to give may be the lifeline for a weary soul who has lost hope. But none of that happens if you wait, if you reason it away, if you drown the prompting in excuses. Obedience requires imagination, not the imagination of fantasy, but of responsibility. It asks you to consider the unseen impact of your faithfulness. It challenges you to see that what feels small or inconvenient may be monumental in someone else's life. You don't need to see the outcome to know that it matters. God sees it. He wouldn't ask you if it didn't. We all like to think we would obey if we knew the stakes. But God, in His wisdom, often withholds the full picture. He doesn't show us who's on the other side of our obedience. He simply asks us to trust Him. That trust is the furnace where maturity is forged. It is the sacred tension of not knowing the full impact and still choosing to say yes. The truth is, God could accomplish His will in 1,000 ways. He does not need us, but He has chosen to work through us. This is both a mystery and a mercy. To be used by God is to carry a responsibility that is both humbling and urgent. Our lives become conduits for divine intention. Our obedience becomes a pathway for someone else's encounter with God. Every time we hear His voice and act, we become part of that divine choreography. We become participants in miracles we may never witness. And while the visible results may never reach our eyes, eternity will hold the evidence. Obedience that seems forgotten here will not be forgotten there. What was done in secret, done in fear, in faith, in trembling, will be revealed as the turning point in someone's story. When God nudges your heart, when He calls you to step out, speak up, or simply act in kindness, know this: it is never just about you. There is always someone else in the frame. Someone who needs you to move. Someone whose answer is waiting on your yes. And that yes carries a holy weight. It's not just faithfulness, it's intercession in motion. You are part of how God meets others. So now you've heard it, perhaps not for the first time, but maybe for the last before this window closes. You were meant to hear this, not by accident or random scroll or wandering curiosity. God has spoken. Maybe in whispers, maybe in moments long past that still echo in your spirit, or maybe in a fresh stirring you can't shake. And what matters most is not how clearly you've heard, but what you do with it before this weekend ends. Don't let the urgency fade into habit. Don't wait for a sign when you've already received a word. Don't forfeit divine timing for the illusion of better circumstances. Move. Do what He said, not because it's easy, not because you feel ready, but because He is worthy, because someone else is waiting, because delay has already stolen enough, and because obedience is the only way you'll ever know what He truly had in mind. God doesn't need you to be certain. He needs you to be faithful. Not later. Now, before the weekend ends.